Well, hello there, and welcome to our presentation on the fundamentals of effective third-party service provider management. My name is Brian Willis. I'm a senior manager and QSA with LBMC Information Security.
And I'm Kyle Hinterberg, a manager and QSA with LBMC Information Security as well.
So to begin, why is third-party service provider management important? Well, whether we're talking about a small business or a large international enterprise, nearly all entities outsource some of their IT and/or security operations. Now, these outsourced services could range from basic payment terminal management all the way to large security operations centers. Now, a common misconception is that by outsourcing, entities can eliminate their need for PCI compliance. Well, even though outsourcing services can help to reduce the scope of compliance, outsourcing does not eliminate an entity's compliance obligations. It's important to note that PCI DSS version 4 has expanded on the service provider requirements that were included in or intended by version 3.2.1. Therefore, for our presentation, we'll be referencing the requirements as they've been laid out in DSS version 4. So a brief agenda. We'll be answering the question, what is a third-party service provider? We'll address how customers should handle their third-party service provider relationships. We'll cover how service providers should handle their customer relationships. We'll answer what if a service provider does not have an attestation of compliance. And then we'll discuss the service provider relationships of an example merchant before we conclude. So Kyle, help us understand, what is a third-party service provider?
Well, Brian, the best definition of a third-party service provider is actually in the PCI glossary. It's a business entity that is not a payment brand, but is directly involved in the processing, storage, or transmission of cardholder data on behalf of an entity. This also includes companies that provide services that control or could impact the security of cardholder data. And just to get a couple other terms out of the way, a customer is an entity which leverages a service provider to achieve PCI DSS compliance, and a consumer is an actual individual card holder. So a consumer would be able to use their credit card to make a purchase from an entity, and that entity may be a customer of a service provider. And just to help us understand these terms a little bit better, let's look at some examples of service providers. MSSPs are a great example. They may provide services from log management to full IT administration. Another is a payment gateway. They are receiving your cardholder data, and they may be providing additional services such as tokenization or iframes. Cloud hosting providers tend to be one of the most common service providers Brian and I see. And one thing to note on a cloud hosting provider is just because you're using a PCI DSS compliant cloud provider does not mean your cloud environment is automatically PCI DSS compliant. And if you have any questions around what your responsibility might be there, Brian will actually be talking about that just a little bit later on. And then last here we have listed individual contractors, and this one can be a little bit tricky. If you hire an individual contractor to perform some function such as develop a payment application, they're going to be a service provider and you need to treat them accordingly. However, if you're working with a contractor agency and you have contractors that you treat more or less like regular employees who go through the same training and have to sign off on the same information security policies, you would not need to treat each of those individuals as a service provider. And now, just to help us better understand, let's look at some things that are not service providers. For instance, acquirers. They are generally not a service provider unless they're performing additional functions such as being a payment gateway. Device manufacturers, just because you have a Cisco firewall does not mean that Cisco is one of your service providers unless they're providing additional services beyond just selling you equipment. And public network access providers. These would be your internet service provider or your telephone network provider. If you're just leveraging them to access the public network like anyone else would, you wouldn't need to consider them a service provider. And if you have any more questions on what may or may not be a service provider, where could they go and find some information about that, Brian?
Well, Kyle, there's some important resource documents and references that all entities and QSA should be familiar with. First, of course, is the data security standard itself, particularly the introductory section on the use of third-party service providers. There's an information supplement on third-party security assurance. There's a guidance document on connected to service providers. And there are several FAQ articles that the PCI Council has published on the topic. And of course, all of these resources available through the PCI Council's website. So let's review a summary of the requirements for third-party service provider management. First of all, customer responsibilities. Again, customers, those who are using the services. First, they must maintain a list of third-party service providers. They must maintain written agreements with their service providers. They must perform due diligence when engaging their service providers. They must monitor the compliance of service providers at least every 12 months. And finally, they must document which requirements are managed by a third-party service provider, which are managed by the customer, and which are shared between the entities. And then on the other hand, we have requirements that are applicable specifically to service providers. These include supporting customers by providing this requested documentation, and then by adhering to the PCI DSS requirements as documented in their service agreements. So to review these requirements in more detail, Kyle, where do we begin?
Sure thing. The first one is requirement 12.8.1, and it may seem like the most obvious requirement. And it's simply that you need to maintain a list of all of your service providers, and this list needs to include a description of the services provided. The most important thing here is that this list needs to include all of your service providers. If you have any vendor that you're using to maintain or help you maintain any aspect of your PCI DSS compliance program, you need to make sure that they are listed here. Additionally, you need to include this within your normal PCI DSS compliance program and make sure that you're updating it and regularly. One of the best ways to do this is through a vendor management program. Oftentimes we see individuals who have a very mature vendor management program and they just make sure that it's meeting the requirements that PCI states, and that way they're keeping that list updated and reviewed regularly. Next, we have requirement 12.8.2. And this is that you need to have written agreements with your service providers. And those written agreements need to include an acknowledgement from the service provider that they're responsible for cardholder information and anything they have access to or anything they could affect the security of. And part of that, is really making sure that you understand which services you're contracting with. A lot of times customers think they just need to have that AOC and that you have your attestation of compliance and that covers you. But the problem is many service providers provide additional services that may not be covered by their attestation of compliance. And so this is when we are reviewing a relationship between an entity and a service provider. You need to look at that merchant agreement, and understand what the agreement is between the merchant and their service provider, as well as the attestation of compliance, to make sure that those services are the contracted services that are being referenced in that attestation. And as a note on that, the piece for the acknowledgement of the responsibility of protecting cardholder data, that's not always included, kind of in boilerplate contracts or master service agreements. So you may need to have an addendum added just to make sure that your service provider is acknowledging that properly. And then we have requirement 12.8.3, the requirement to perform due diligence prior to engaging a service provider. This is really the point where you build your foundation between an entity and a service provider, and the chance where you have to make sure that that service provider is as secure as you need them to be. Not all service providers should be treated equally here. Sometimes you may have a service provider that you're onboarding who is going to have full access to account data. And other times you may be onboarding a service provider who's just, performing data center hosting. And those are very different things, and they need to be treated appropriately during the due diligence to make sure that they are protecting your cardholder data as they appropriately should. Next, what are a few more things, Brian, that they need to be covering to make sure they're properly managing vendor compliance?
Well, Kyle, requirement 12.8.4 states that an entity must have a program implemented to monitor their service provider's compliance status at least every 12 months. Now, this usually includes collecting their service provider's attestations to be sure they're successfully maintaining their compliance. Failure to provide an attestation or even a compliant attestation will need to be evaluated by the entity and their QSA to determine any additional actions. Now, as you may know, service providers can submit to Visa and MasterCard's service provider registries, which are publicly searchable. And depending on the service or the services provided, the PCI Council has stated that these listings may be considered sufficient evidence for a provider to demonstrate their compliance. Now, if the service provider does not complete an annual assessment or provide an attestation, Other documentation, such as a SOC report or an ISO certificate, may be collected to help and inform an assessment. However, these documents cannot be substituted for an attestation. So you can utilize these artifacts as part of the assessment, but their PCI compliance must still be validated. Requirement 12.8.5 states that an entity must maintain information about which PCI requirements are managed by each of their service providers, which are managed by the entity themselves, and any that are shared between the service providers and the entity. Now, for some service providers, this may be easily identified. For instance, a data center provider typically is responsible for all of the physical security controls. In some instances, they may be responsible for many of the account or access control requirements. But for some service providers, particularly with a more complex relationship, additional documents such as a responsibility matrix may be required. Now, the example shown here is one that the Council has published that clearly delineates between responsibilities for each requirement for the service provider, the entity, and any that are shared. These documents should be reviewed regularly by the customer to confirm that they accurately define the relevant responsibilities. And one of the areas where we've seen entities be successful with this requirement and the previous requirement are to review these documents, to request these documents as part of their annual service renewal cycle, and in the event where you have a multi-year contract, that they do this just upon the service anniversary. Then we come to requirements 12.9.1 and 12.9.2, which are applicable specifically to service providers. These require service providers to acknowledge in writing their responsibility for protecting account data, that is card account data, and supporting their customers' compliance. They're also required to support their customers' requests for this required documentation, including any PCI compliance and responsibility documents, such as the example we just provided. And finally, providers are required to maintain relevant PCI DSS requirements to provide compliance services as they defined in their service agreements and these responsibility documents. Keep in mind that if a service provider is providing attestation, yet they are failing to meet these requirements, it may call their attestation itself into question, or at the very least, they may be in breach of their agreements. So Kyle, help us understand, what if a service provider does not have an attestation?
Just because a service provider doesn't have an attestation does not mean an entity cannot contract with them. It just means that that service provider needs to be included in that entity's annual PCI DSS compliance audit and assessment. If that service provider is storing, transmitting, or processing cardholder data on behalf of that entity, it may be a fairly intensive process to review that service provider. And because of this, we tend to see more non-attested service providers provide specific services which are more readily reviewed, such as document shredding or a managed SIM. But either way, all the relevant portions need to be reviewed as part of that entity's assessment, and this includes people, processes, and technologies, just the same as it would for a regular assessment. And if you do have any non-attested service providers within an assessment, it's going to be important to identify them early. Usually that is going to increase the length of time it takes to properly perform an assessment, which is why they need to identify them and address them appropriately.
Now, we'd like to share an example of a merchant that we work with who uses a variety of service providers for their family entertainment venues. First of all, of course, is their acquiring bank, who in this case also provides payment gateway services. They use a separate payment gateway service provider for one of their payment terminal solutions, and then they use yet another payment gateway for their e-commerce and mobile app payment channels. In each of these instances, the entity collects and annually collects the attestation of compliance from each of these providers. They also utilize a managed SIM and security ops center provider, as well as a managed endpoint security monitoring provider. For each of these providers do not formally attest to PCI compliance, and therefore the entity and we as their QSA engage these providers directly to validate their compliance with the applicable requirements.
Additionally, they have web application development and hosting, as well as mobile app developing. And those are services that also those providers are able to provide them with the attestation of compliance. They also have a P2PE solution provider, and in that case, we just need to review that P2PE validation documentation as well as the P2PE implementation manual, or PIM. And lastly, they have a web-based virtual terminal for refund processing, which is actually provided to them by a very large, well-known payment provider. And so this is one of the instances where we're just able to review that Visa listing to verify compliance.
So as we close, a few helpful reminders. First, written agreements define relationships. From contracts to attestations, be sure third parties' compliance obligations are clear. Second, customers and their service providers need to work together to maintain compliance and healthy relationships. Be sure to take a partnership and not an adversarial approach to securing cardholder data. And finally, diligence is key for customers. Be sure to hold your service providers accountable for their contractual and compliance obligations. And with that, on behalf of my colleague, Kyle Hinterberg, I'm Brian Willis. We'd like to thank the PCI Council for the privilege of presenting today and you for your attention. Thank you. Be safe and be well.